Okay, I'm going to get going. Good morning, Dawn. Get yourself tea, coffees, and cups of water if you want. We've got a packed schedule today. We've got 3 different presentations, and I'll introduce them all so you'll get an idea of who's who. I just wanted to say a few things about what's happening at ACO. And first thing to tell you is that I am retiring this year, and I'm going to be standing down as Chief Executive at the end of October. So I've done 9 years. I think that's a fair amount of time to work on this year. We've got someone else not quite ready to announce yet, but hopefully we'll get that out to you next week. On the 1st of November, he will be ready to visit and get to know you. And I think back 9 years when I didn't know anybody at ACO. So one thing I should always say is that you were incredibly welcoming group, and I know you'll welcome my successor. So it's been a year of huge change. So Catherine went in February. I'm going now. Eddie is also going to change as well. So he won't be here at the next grant making forum. So the original team that brought ACO to this point is now changing, and it's a good time to bring in new people and new ideas. So ACO will be going around picking your brains on what you want and how we should adjust for the future. So it's an exciting time. We're going to move office also next month. So we'll have a new address and we'll send all that out to you. We're going to be at Toynbee Hall on Commercial Street at Aldgate. So new office space. We won't be at King's Cross anymore. And of course we've got Hannah and Claire, who are our new staff members, and you will have noticed, if you keep an eye on social media, an explosion in ACO's social media content, and we really want to link up with all of you and make the most of digital opportunities, which I think we'll hear a little bit about today. So just wanted to let you know about that and how much I've loved coming to these meetings for the last 9 years and working with you all. We'll get stuck into the agenda. So the first team of presenters, it's a double-handed presentation. We have David from IE Brand, who are a new corporate member, and he is the creative director and brand consultant. And we have Nick, who's the marketing and communications manager at the Clergy Support Trust. And it is about how a venerable 365-year-old benevolent charity embarked on an ambitious project to rename, rebrand, build a new website. And those of you who monitor The Guardian, they've had a very interesting article about the needs of clergy this week, which I recommend you to look at. A very good example of how you can use the media. So I'll just hand over to David and to Nick.
Thank you and welcome to this session. So, as I say, really the hope is that this is a candid discussion with an agency and one of our clients, Clergy Support Trust, formerly Sons and Friends of the Clergy. And they came to us, 18 months, 2 years ago, perhaps, to help with a research, rename, rebrand project, and we eventually went on to build their website as well. So we're going to spend the next 30 minutes really taking you through the case study of this project, but very much asking Nick here questions throughout, so that you hopefully get some sense of what it's like both from an agency to do these kind of projects, but also from clients' perspective as well. And Nick will be painfully honest with you, so we won't just tell you all the parts of the project that went swimmingly well, but also the hiccups that happen whenever you undertake these big change projects. So I won't do introductions, but I will just tell you a little bit about our agency before we start. So we are a brand and digital agency based in the Jewellery Quarter in Birmingham, and we're celebrating our 25th anniversary this year. And for that time, we've exclusively worked with charity, health and education clients. As was said, we're an ACO corporate member, and we often work with benevolent organisations, membership organisations, so we kind of know the world that you're in quite well. Here are some of the clients that we've worked with. Been fortunate enough to pick up a number of national and pan-European brand and digital awards over the time, but that really is all I will say about us. Before I invite Nick to tell you a little bit more about the charity, I just thought it would be helpful to unpack the term brand. because it is a word that is charged with meaning, different things to different people. Sometimes it's mistakenly believed that your brand is your logo, which causes no end of confusion and frustration, not least because if you've got a savvy marketeer on board that's been telling you or been telling the board for some years we need to invest in our brand and spend some time on our brand, sometimes when people think it's all about the logo, we hear those terrible headlines where people say, look at all the donor money that's been spent on this logo that my 7-year-old niece could have designed, and all of these kind of headlines that you sometimes see. So we know that that's what a brand is not. What is it? Lots of people have tried to define this over the years. Simon Middleton, who's a self-appointed brand guru that does the rounds in these kind of sessions, would say that brand is the sum total of all the meanings that all the possible audiences carry around about you in their heads and in their hearts. Quite bold there. Michael Eisner, the former chief exec of Disney, once said that a brand is a living entity and it is enriched or undermined cumulatively over time, the product of 1,000 small gestures. My favourite is Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, who says your brand is what other people say about you when you're not in the room, which I quite like. And on that point, I would say that a brand as a term is, in our minds at least, almost synonymous with another word that you will recognise, and that word is reputation. Because your brand, whether people are coming to it for the first time or they are familiar with it, it really is all of the things that people think you do, why they think you do it, the impact that they think that might have, and how likely they are to engage with you. Another metaphor that we really enjoy is brand as a person, because we're complex as human beings, and we all have our own personal brands. So I am here, the first time I'm sure most of you will have met me, and you'll have some clues about me. So based on what I'm wearing, that's my visual identity, much like a brand. My tone of voice, the way in which I'm talking about you, is similar almost to that kind of tone of voice and brand personality we might expect with our messaging. And just like people, brands can either be utterly memorable or entirely forgettable. I'm sure you've all been to conferences where you've met somebody and the following year you will go back and you'll instantly remember them and you'll say, oh, we had that chat, didn't we? How is your son doing? He'd just gone to university, hadn't he? And there are some people that shake your hand and you must have met them, but for the life of you, you simply can't remember who they are or what they were about. And brands are very similar. And clearly, our space in the market is that we think that not-for-profits especially can't afford to be those invisible brands. You hear these words like best-kept secret or hidden treasure. Absolutely useless. Nobody wants to be in that place. So hopefully that's unpacked a little bit about brand as a concept. So now let's begin the conversation with Nick. And Sons and Friends of the Clergy, as the organisation was when it came to us. I'd love you to start, Nick, by telling us a little bit about the charity and the challenges you were facing before you met IE.
So I came on board probably about 6 months before we began this branding experience, as it were. But the trustees had already sort of noticed that we've been around for 365 years, and that brings with it both the real blessing of history and the separate problem that people have a real historical understanding of who you are. And we had already significantly shifted our grant-making procedures. In fact, we combined two charities together, Sons of the Clergy and Friends of the Clergy, hence Sons and Friends of the Clergy. Didn't involve a brand agency in that one. So we were looking at what do people think we are, what are we, and how we actually perceived. And one of the biggest challenges I think we were having, and the reason a lot of this process started, was we were having people come to us and say, I'm a daughter of clergy, can I apply? Or I can't apply. They didn't even get to the point of coming through the door. So we support the Anglican clergy, so that's Church of England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales. And we help clergy, but we also help their families, partners, including divorced and separated partners, widowed and retired. So there's quite a wide range of potential beneficiaries that we support, that our name, to be honest, was unhelpful and was causing a barrier. But that didn't necessarily, we couldn't exactly call it sons and daughters and friends and widows and retired of the clergy. That wasn't going to work. The other sort of thing we have is, over time we have supported stuff that we no longer do, like we used to support lots of clergy in terms of going through, their kids going through further education, higher education, and that was something that we sort of felt that over time was less needed as the support for the clergy from centrally had changed. So we were looking at, how do we communicate both what we do and get to the people who are actually interested in our grants and we can support. And we are also, because we've been around for a long time, we've got the resources to support more people. So we're looking to raise the awareness of us, to lift up who we were. And one other thing that changed significantly in the last sort of 10, 20 years is the role of a bishop. You might not be aware, but they're sort of like an area manager or a county chief exec. And they're in charge of all the clergy in their county, but their role has got significantly busier. So the understanding of both our existence and the passing that down to other people within the diocese that a bishop is involved in wasn't there. So we had two problems. We changed our brand in 2012 to Sons and Friends of the Clergy, and we were having beneficiaries coming to us or hearing sort of through the grapevine that they were possibly not applying to us in the first place. Yeah, we knew that we were able to provide grants that made a real difference to them, both in their daily lives with financial support, health grants, that kind of area. So that's kind of a summary of who we are and what we do and the challenge we were facing.
Absolutely, and it's worth saying that clients come to us at different points. It's a continuum, as you could imagine, and some people want to make internal strategic change before they do a project like this, and let's put them at this end of the continuum. Some know that the organisation needs to change and they want us to be part of that journey, so they bring us in right at the beginning. I would say that your charity was somewhere in the middle, or possibly leaning towards already having some sense of significant change. So new chief exec, for instance, was on board. Already I think you recognise that where once the organisation perhaps, and I might be being a little bit unfair here, might have been seen to be an organisation that wrote cheques, that it was a much bigger agenda of holistic well-being, and you were already partway through that journey, I would say, when we met.
I think that's fair to say. I think the Trust, we'd also looked at, we wanted to do cultural change as well in terms of the way we related to our beneficiaries, using more email, digital means, as opposed to just writing letters and sending cheques. And also my role, being marketing communications manager, hadn't existed. So I was the first in 365 years. I had to sort of figure out how we then look at that and how we be more externally focused. The trustees had decided they wanted that role in place. At the same time, we were about to commission IE design.
Unanimously seen as the best marketer so far at the organisation, though, aren't you?
Yes, I am by far the best. The only.
So, a really interesting point. I would say that the charity really wanted confidence, based on research which we went out and did for them, that some of the decisions they were thinking about making were the right decisions. So, I don't think anybody really thought that the name could be kept. But there's a big difference between, perhaps some
no, we did
things,
actually, as part of our brief, it was quite clear that we wanted to do research to find out what we thought we were hearing was actually the case, but also part of the brief was whether we should change our brand. Because changing your brand is significant, and when you're a charity, you want to use your funds appropriately. You don't want to end up in a case of changing your brand and then having to change it back. I'm sure we can all think of some examples of that recently, where in fact it ended up doing the opposite, it alienated beneficiaries.
Yeah, that's a really fair clarification, because I would say, perhaps if I re-expressed it, that I think everybody knew that there were drawbacks with the current name, but really what we wanted was to go out to the market and see what are the opportunities versus the risks. And absolutely, Nick's right, oftentimes when we're brought in for clients with a rename, more often than not actually, we will recommend don't change your name. It might not be perfect, but it's got so much rich brand equity and recognisability there, you'd be a fool to change it. So we're always very open-minded, but what we really wanted to know is, okay, we know the drawbacks of the name, let's see if we can collect a dossier of evidence that say, but the advantages of it are far outweigh, and that proved not to be the case, as we'll go through and see. So how would you say internally the process of deciding that you needed to rebrand, and more than that you needed to find an agency partner?
So a little bit of this occurred before my time, but essentially it was a classical case of we talk to 3 different people, we see what their kind of quotes are, what their pitches are like, what kind of ideas they have, and then we look at a cost-benefit analysis. We're like any beneficiary organisation, quite financially driven, having a look through is this going to make sense? It was still a little bit of a punt. It was a bit of a... By punt, I mean the trustees were taking a step out because it was outside of our comfort zone, outside of what we'd done before, and we needed to have certainty that we could come to the end and talk to our supporters, talk to our beneficiaries, and say we didn't waste our money and our time exploring this avenue. And so in the end it meant, well, obviously we chose yourselves, but we felt just comfortable and like you would challenge us, but not necessarily try to rebrand us beyond where we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we are a traditional beneficiary organisation. While this might look quite radical, and you've got the thing on there, it wasn't too radical. We're not sort of turning ourselves into a symbol or something like that.
Yeah. Absolutely, and it was stressed right from the beginning that this, whatever recommendations were made, that it absolutely needed to pass the test of a bunch of trustees that quite rightly saw their role in preserving that 365 years of history and took it really seriously. And whatever we were going to do, it needed to be based on evidence, and that's absolutely where we started. So we went out and we spoke to a number of people to get a better sense of perceptions of the brand and the name, and that's where we started to hear lots of things that reinforced what you already knew, Nick. A sense that some people thinking that the organisation was all about sending your son to boarding school and all of these kind of things, and you're always shouting at the research, no, this can't be true, but it was. And then we made a number of recommendations to the trustees. I won't, just in the interest of time, take you through all of them, but the main one was that we recommended that you change name. And along that journey, we had a naming workshop where we got a bunch of internal stakeholders together, and we explored pros and cons of a name change, and also what we call naming territories. So looking at all of the things that we would love the name to do, and reflect, and there were some quite bizarre suggestions, I seem to remember, in that workshop, where we were going through a thesaurus looking for synonyms for vaguely obscure words. And what we always say with renaming is that it's remarkable how few options often you find there are. Often you will think there's got to be something out there. There's got to be another word in the English language that perfectly describes who we are and what we do. But actually, when you get it onto a flip chart, which we did, and more than that, when you start crossing things off because a word might be loaded or really inappropriate, you actually end up with a relatively few in your shortlist, I think. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think it came down to there were about 3 or 4 words that we, from the research, there's a lot of interviews we did initially, phone interviews, would be in the right kind of space. And then obviously we went out and we took that back to our beneficiaries. And we had about 1,200 or so people who then fed back on what they thought was right or wrong, so that we could then at the end of that process kind of pull together a graph and have an idea of a recommendation based on data. So that when we weren't going to be coming back to it and going, oh, we really shouldn't have called it the Clergy Support Charity, now we've got to change our name again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I wonder if you could tell us, so that day came where internally, by which I mean marketing team, internal executive, chief exec, we all kind of felt we were on the right lines, but we needed to put that case to trustees. We felt we had a reasonably strong case, reasonable dossier of evidence, but I wonder if you could just tell everybody how the findings were received in that session and how important their buy-in was to eventually getting this thing through.
Well, so we'd had a look at it internally as a sort of management team, trying to figure out, we know that our trustees were going to have a number of responses to it, being that they also reflect a wide section of our stakeholders, from bishops through to just people in HR and that kind of area. So we tried to present it clearly. Now we made a mistake. We presented it on a projector that didn't show colours very well, so it looked rather brown. And because we're human, people commented on that. But we went through a variety of feedback. One of them, the initial version, there was a word that sounded more medical. Accidentally, it sounded like we were providing hernias. But that was something that was pointed out by our trustees, and this is just the part of the recommendation to include as many people as possible, because you can easily avoid such mistakes by getting as much feedback as possible before you get onto the process of then implementing the brand, which is actually a much larger process than deciding on the name. So it was...
And am I right in saying that it was unusually unanimous for
It was
that
unusually
bunch of
unanimous,
people, yeah.
But I think that's not as surprising, because we'd spent time looking at the various audiences we had, defining what their needs were. Again, a process that we hadn't done as much internally, that matrix, then doing the interviews, then getting the feedback from the data, and it was pretty much like, well, this is a slam dunk. This is the sort of does what it says on the tin. that our beneficiaries appreciate. And while there's some little bits of do we add stuff to it, where do we put the cross, because we're after all supporting the church without looking like we are a church. Do we have a big cross, don't we have a big cross? There was a number of iterations around that, as I'm sure people have mentioned. But it just felt sort of right, but it took a little bit of time to learn. And I've rebranded organisations myself and my own experience, most small charities. And it usually is that you go round the houses a little bit and then you come back pretty much to the first suggestion. It just takes time for it to grow on you.
And it was really
to
helpful.
feel like it's correct.
It was really felt helpful to have somebody like Nick, who has been involved so much in this process, both from agency side but also client side, because there was a real awareness of the processes that we were going through. And I think it's really helpful to organisations to have people on the inside that have walked that journey before. So one of the things that we did before developing the visual identity was to sign off something called a success criteria design brief. Design is incredibly subjective. If you have ever done one of these projects before, you'll know that lots of people will take lots of recommendations as read, but when you put designs on the table, everybody's inner designer that they didn't know was there seems to emerge and come to the forefront, and everybody has an opinion. And if you're sitting around a table like this, there is absolutely no way, no design I could ever show you which we would all absolutely be delighted with, because we would all choose a different make and colour of car and decorate our living rooms differently. So we're always saying to clients, what we're trying is not to give you something that you're going to hang with pride over your hearth at home. It's about saying, does this do its job in the marketplace? Is it going to be successful with the audiences? And this document is a way of us trying to remove some of that subjectivity and say it will have done a good job if. And everybody signs up to that, including Nick and Chief Exec and the executive team. We also took them through a messaging piece. So messaging often, I think, is as important as the visuals, really. And lots of organisations, and I think not-for-profits are particularly guilty of this, not always being able to articulate very succinctly who they are and what they do. And that can be really paralysing for organisations. And sometimes we can sweep in because we're objective and we're not immersed in this problem day to day, and give you a way of describing that kind of elevator pitch. Oh yes, I'm phoning from X. We are ... And just putting that in place can be remarkable, the difference that can have. So this is a messaging matrix. We're big believers in keeping things on one page, because when you give a client a 12-page A4 report, it tends to end up at the bottom of the filing cabinet, whereas we want this to be pinned onto a notice board and being used day in, day out, 6 months, 12 months after a rebrand, so that you can ask yourself, when you're writing some comms, am I still on message? And also it's really useful to give to copywriters whose job is to be able to flip between the tone of voice and personality of many different brands. And they will often say, show me something like this so that I can inhabit the way to write for this brand. And here you can see the identity starting to come through. The very first time Nick and the team would have seen this, we showed probably 20, 30 presentation boards. These are A3 boards on a table. And unlike some agencies, we don't do what is called the beauty parade. We don't come and say, here are 4 or 5 logos, you tell us which one you like. We've got a real problem with that, and that is that what tends to happen is that the time gets split 4 or 5 ways for a start, but you end up with design by committee, and everybody says, could we have the butterfly from number 1, but the triangle from number 4, and before you know it, you've got this homogeneous Frankenstein's monster. So instead, we say to clients, it's really simple. We won't start work until we're really confident that we've got the problem and how to solve it. Let us try, and if we don't, we undertake at no extra cost to go back and repeat that process. But one of the things you can see, and this came through in the messaging, this idea of how can we help. We felt that this was a great phrase that encapsulated everything that Clergy Support Trust was about. And we said this should be on all of your comms. Good practice going on behind you there. You can see it happening. Business cards, it's the way you might answer the phone. Everything, and you'll see this coming through in the website, was guided towards that one question. It's what they existed to do. And you can see here just a glimpse of the brand guidelines that emerged, all of that classic messaging pieces, how to use the logo and elements, colours. Obviously, these boards will be circulated to you. I'm just flicking through in the interests of time. The do's and don'ts, approach to photography. We wanted to really get real people, I think it's fair to say, and not just lots of people in church settings.
We're still working on that side of things, because one of the issues is that we're supporting people who are in a place where they're in financial need, but if they highlight they're in financial need, that can cause an issue with their work. And we're slowly getting towards getting more photos of dog collars and so on, as in real clergy and doing real things. But we wanted to break down that idea of being very starchy up front in front of a podium. These are real people who've got, the problem, the car broken down, and they need help with that, or an unforeseen health issue. So while initially we've gone with significant amount of stock photos, it's been around what's the kind of clergy that we know, what's the kind of beneficiaries that we connect with in our daily applications. And if I just briefly come back to the how can we help thing, now we found that a little bit, initially there was an aspect of, is that too trite? It was quite a big jump for us because we were transitioning from one may apply through the following process to how can we help. It was part of our looking at how we move relationally. So this sort of rebranding process was alongside an internal process of looking at all of our comms, how do we connect better with people, make them feel like they're being really loved and supported by an organisation. So Clergy Support Trust, I think we got on board with very quickly. How can we help? It's taking a little bit longer, but it's definitely getting there. Although it's still very much a thing in process. Like you might see on the leaflet in front of you here, it says, support for Anglican clergy and their families. It's sort of a relatively simple, succinct way of describing us. But we're having a lot of feedback from single clergy at the moment saying, well, that feels like it doesn't include us. And we're trying to realise what's the right way of doing that. Previously we'd have used things like support for Anglican clergy and their dependents, but what's a dependent? Do people just instantly understand that? They don't. We're working around how we describe that. It's an ongoing process, but things like that matrix, using words like, instead of going with financial hardship, we're going with financial need, financial support. There's lots of wording changes across many systems.
And that's great because we're big believers that when you complete a project like this, that's day one. And all brands need to continually evolve. And that's the way of, hopefully in 5, 10, maybe even 15 years where you do need to look at another iteration of the brand. Hopefully it won't have been years, it'll have constantly been evolving rather than that kind of drastic action that people sometimes feel they need to take because they probably feel that the brand should have been done 10 years previously. So just before we talk about digital, which happened next, how would you say so far the kind of brand and the new name was received initially? So we launched it up in Manchester, deliberately trying to go a bit further northern to avoid any kind of southern bias. And we had people come up to us, and I've never experienced this before, where they actually thanked us for changing the name. And especially women, obviously. But they were literally thankful. But it wasn't just changing the name, it was lots of different photos of showing what looked like real people. So the feedback was just broadly positive, but we also found that we learnt a little bit even in that process, because this was us putting ourselves above the parapet. We made quite a bit of a song and dance at this sort of conference event. There was interviews, etc., that some people didn't know we existed, partly because of that problem of being around for so long that it wasn't handed down from person to person. So it was the start of a journey, but very informative, and it sort of felt like we had lots of people come up to us and use this exact phrase, which was, it does what it says on the tin. And since then, we've had further feedback from people who've received grants from us. Thank you. So we still had a little bit of feedback online, but I think we're talking about 2 or 3 tweets out of, we support about 2,000 people a year, which was nothing. No, absolutely. We were delighted as well. Very little pushback, I think, and that's always a good sign that you were right to do what you did, I think. So I've just been told that I've been looking at the wrong clock, which is apparently slow. So I will just pick up the pace. Apologies. Okay, super. So next project, quite common. You've got your new name, research, rebrand. Website is obviously the number one comms tool that you have. You needed a new one, and you invited IE to pitch for that again. Wasn't a done deal, but we threw our hat in the ring again with a number of competitors. Talk me through the website project.
So the website's in my background. I've been making websites since like 98 or even earlier, I can't remember now. It makes me an internet dinosaur, and I always had a lot of opinions around this, but we already had a website solution in place, a new website that was starting. But when I looked at it, I compared it to our existing website, it was very much, we hadn't iterated, we hadn't moved anywhere further. It didn't feel like, we were still saying these are our objectives, these are where you can apply, but it didn't feel like it connected. So we looked at a number of people, including guys who do a lot of our graphics work. In fact, they're the ones who are producing these, and went through several different application processes. But we had a very, again, specific set of criteria around. It needs to be, sorry if I bore you here, but a content management system that's open source, that will be developed, not an in-house proprietary version. Looking at a lot of the technology kind of things, so that going forward we could extend it as and when we need to add something on, like say an events calendar that already exists, doesn't need to be custom coded, and that again keeps the costs down for the charity and maximises flexibility. But I think we actually came back to looking at the original boards that were presented through to the trustees, and looking at, there was an example website in there along with a lot of the paraphernalia that goes with that, leaflets and so on. And we felt, actually, no, that does really feel like the kind of direction we need to go. We need to have a bit of a departure from reproducing our website in a slightly different format to actually going with something that's far more people photography driven.
And I think what we did is we really held ourselves to account to this how can we help, didn't we? And my team and Nick's team, we developed this eligibility calculator, because one of the barriers we identified was simply a lot of potential beneficiaries not recognising that the charity was for them, so perhaps feeling that you might have to be in a more desperate situation rather than just we haven't had a washing machine, in the house for some time. So much like if you were to go onto a high street bank mortgage calculator, before you had to go through the dense forms, it would give you some sense of indicatively this is what you might get, or further signposting. So we wanted to do something very like that, and you can see that directly under the website, how can we help? Check eligibility, there it is, it's 5 questions, it takes 2 to 3 minutes, and it will give you some sense of whether it's worth going through the more onerous application process.
It's not that onerous anymore.
No.
We're working on it.
And but
it is part of, just highlighting these are our name maybe can't say our beneficiaries, but the first thing we say on the front of our website is this is who's eligible. Yeah. Again, in the next version of this leaflet, it's going, here's what you can get. Trying to make it as simple as possible to access the support we provide.
And just quick answer, Nick, doing brand and digital simultaneously, madness or absolutely necessary? Lots of people ask us this question.
I think necessary, but it was a tight time frame.
Yes, it was.
I think we gave them 2 months start to finish with the website. That was our fault.
We said we can do it, but can you do it? Because in all seriousness, often it's the client side where it falls down because of getting content up and all of these.
Yeah, it's very much a partnership. So yes, but it wasn't just these things. It was also, we launched an animated video explaining who we support. It was changing all our grant systems. There was a large number of things we did at once.
And finally, impact, which is what this is all about. Could you tell us a little bit about that top statistic, which we were really pleased with, the 84% increase?
An 84% increase in grant applications, yeah. So this come alongside new grants criteria, which we launched at the start of July, with some more friendly wellbeing and emergency grants that are easy to apply for. But essentially, the graph's just gone up in terms of the applications, and that was one of the key things we wanted to do, was to reach more people, geographically more dispersed, because we operate throughout the UK and Ireland, and we have a strategic goal to double the number of people we support in terms of reaching out, and we've kind of done that in the first 2 months of July and August. So we're looking at, do we look at tripling it going forward? There's obviously a number of other considerations, but I think we feel like we have the tools we need to reach the beneficiaries, and we don't have a blockage anymore. And now the question is, how do we describe ourselves?
Stage 2. Wonderful. Do we have a couple of minutes for questions?
Yes, we do. So if there's any questions, could you...
Yeah, can I ask?
Oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just wondered, when we're doing all of this, did you look at a new database for how you manage your applications, linked to the website?
A CRM, you mean?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a company.
Sorry.
So we're just trying to record the video, that's all.
Oh, sorry.
So the question was about whether we had a new database, a CRM style system to look at.
Yeah.
We kept our existing grants application system as it was, because there's a number of changes that people had to make around both mindset and how we communicate with beneficiaries, and that changing too many things at once is pretty much a recipe for failure. We are considering whether we need to change our grant system going forward, and I do have a separate CRM system job to get done by the end of this year. So, but the website will easily integrate into that. You know, we're a bit late to the day on MailChimp. We're using that now. Just integrating as many systems as possible to simplify the flow of data and reporting and understanding who we help and how we can help them better.
Well, I just want to ask, who funds you?
So our funding has come from a number of sources, but initially Sons and Friends of the Clergy were the sons of the clergy back in sort of 1655, and they were merchants.
Yeah.
Put together an endowment, and then there was a annual service, and there still is at St Paul's, doesn't it? Next year, come along, where it was a fundraising event and money was raised up at the time. So now we have a significant endowment, but we do also have people who give us legacies, donations, that kind of thing.
Because the reason behind that question was when you said about brand at the beginning, I thought if one brand has been damaged in the last few years, it's the clergy. And I just wondered if that caused you any problems with all the sex problems in the church.
So yeah, there have been a number of controversies in the church and how that sort of in terms of damage, we're very much a separate independent charity, and we're quite clear about that, and that's actually one of the concerns of our beneficiaries, that we are independent. You can contact us confidentially. It doesn't impact on your employment. It doesn't get back to your employers. There isn't a sort of a case where we need to double check things. We work closely with the church, and they're a key stakeholder for us, and they allow us a lot of access, and indeed we have people who are within the church who are part of our trustees and part of our decision-making process, but we have been very clear, and you'll see it indeed in all of the things, that we are independent and confidential, and so that allows us to mostly steer clear of any controversy around what the church is doing or issues around particular clergy, but we are mindful of those.
Just following on from that, how do you how do you check then that people are what they say they are, that they are clergy and therefore entitled to your support?
In terms of how we check beneficiaries, there's a rather simple solution, something called Crockford's, where it's a list of all people who are clergy. And so any application, even if it comes, for example, someone who is separated from a member of clergy, the name of the clergy person is in there, and we can verify and double check that they are indeed a potential beneficiary. And we do make other checks. So if they refer to specific houses, we'll look at houses and that kind of thing.
Thank you.
I'm really interested in the research stage that you did before the project. How did you actually manage to recruit such a wide range and a large base of people that you could go to? Because we really struggle with engagement anyway, so that initial research would be quite tricky. So I'm just really interested in what you did to build your base.
So we got 1,200 responses, but we didn't have that many people initially on our database to any degree, really. The way we did it was effectively we asked absolutely everybody and made it as simple as possible to share. So in this case we were using a SurveyMonkey provided by Design, but it was a very short link. It was a very simple and clear ask, and when we made the ask, we made only the ask about the survey. It's amazing how when you ask people's opinions on something, they're usually quite willing to give it as long as they feel they're not going to waste their time. So we were building up our social media, which again we only had Twitter in sort of December 2017, and since then we've added on the rest. But it was beg, borrow and steal, and then we went to a couple of the dioceses who, the various regions said, can you share this? And we took time to do it as well, I think is the thing. I think a period of 2 months, I think it was, something like that.
It's often the longest part of the process. We always do qual and quant really, so we tend to have one-to-one conversations to explore what the parameters of the problem are, and then we go to quant the surveys to give some meat to that and say, okay, 70% of people think that is a problem. So you're absolutely right. Some organisations, it's there and waiting for you. Sometimes you've got to go out. If it's the general public, it's a lot easier because obviously you can go to all of the big polling agencies and chuck a couple of questions in their weekly omnibuses, and there are ways and means of doing that. But it can be a bit of a detective game, really. We'll usually sit down with people internally and say, who do we know about? Who do they know about? And it's the kind of degrees of separation trying to get out to those that we want to talk to. One question there? Maybe one more after this one.
I wanted to take you back to that 82% figure, your rising grant applications.
Yeah.
If you could put your finger on it, I mean, you mentioned that you changed your grants criteria. Do you think that had an effect, or was it the name change, or was it just the way you kind of communicated who you were and what you did, or was it a happy combination?
I think honestly, it's a happy combination. So we, the sort of the rough timeline is that we launched our brand in March, and then we had our sort of annual service where our brand gets a significant. It's our service at St Paul's, so it's called the Festival Service of Clergy Support Trust, which for many of the people who attended, that was the first time of engaging with it. And that was kind of in May, and then it was more like in July that we then changed the criteria. And in fact, we haven't advertised those that significantly because we're still getting used to how we implement that new criteria, and also this holiday and so on. So I would say it's probably half the new brand, which significantly raised the awareness, and especially more widely. But we've got another sort of probably 12 to 18 months of implementing the brand, because it's getting all of the dioceses to update their websites, making sure that everyone knows about us in their email newsletters. That's an ongoing project. But I think the grants being slightly more accessible, again, but partly from thinking through the how do we want to support people, how can we make ourselves more accessible process, which was one and the same, has resulted in some simpler, more accessible grants that don't involve perhaps as much mean testing.
And brand and strategy are very interlinked in that respect. You know, when we make our recommendations, 50% are usually brand related, 50% can be very strategic. You know, not in this case, but we've sometimes been saying to people, you need to change the makeup of your board because that's causing you a problem. And you know, almost when you let us access, we will go and look in all areas and have a sniff around.
Well, thank you very much to both our speakers. You have David's card on the table if you want to talk to David, and I hope you're staying around. So we're grateful to both of you. Thank you very
Wonderful.
much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye. It's worth just saying finally that we have a number of resources if anybody's interested in about. So we have an e-book about how not-for-profits can rebrand and all of the questions that we'd recommend you asking, things like how to write a brief and template. So do get in touch if you want any of those. They're all free. We'll be happy to have a chat with you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.